everybody. This is Carol Maletta. Welcome to the Parenting 411 podcast, where we share information parents need from sources they can trust. Welcome to another episode of the Parenting 411 podcast, your go-to resource for all things related to raising successful and well-prepared children. I'm your host, Carol Maletta, and today we have a special guest who will provide valuable insights into the complex and increasingly competitive world of college admissions. Joining us is Sam Hassell, the founder of Westchester Prep, a respected tutoring and advisory company specializing in guiding students toward their top choice schools and maximizing their chances of success. So in today's episode, we're going to explore the ever-evolving and challenging landscape of college admissions. As we all know, the path to higher education has become more competitive than ever, with increasing numbers of qualified candidates vying for limited spots at prestigious universities and colleges. Admissions officers are constantly refining their criteria, and what they are truly seeking in an applicant can often be shrouded in mystery. So parents, this is an episode you don't want to miss as we dive into the realities of what it takes to stand out in today's college admissions process. Sam Hassell brings a wealth of experience and insider knowledge, having successfully guided numerous students on their journey to top schools. So let's get started. And Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you shed light on the intricacies of college admissions in this challenging landscape.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. So to begin, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to establish Westchester Prep?
Sure. So my name is Sam Hassell. I'm one of the owners at Westchester Prep, and I direct our advising branch, which is called Great Minds Advising at Westchester Prep. And so we are a full service boutique tutoring, test prep, and college advising company, as you mentioned. So we have several locations right above New York City and Westchester, New York, 4 different office locations. And then we work with students all throughout the country, all the way from New York, Connecticut, Florida, all the way across to, California, Silicon Valley, et cetera. In terms of my background, so I have a background primarily in academia and science research. So following graduation, I went to the University of Southern California. I worked in neuroscience research at Columbia University in New York City. And I think a lot of the experiences that I had coming from the research paradigm really helped to inform the approach to the college advising process. So I like to sort of say that a lot of the way that scientific research gets conducted really has to do with telling sort of an articulate, focused story. So if you're a researcher and you have a laboratory, there sort of is like a past, a present, and a future to your research. You've sort of done these experiments and these studies, and then you're trying to sort of put together the next sort of piece of that story around some topic that you're investigating, some question that you have. It might be, how does stress affect happiness, or how does mindset affect stress, or all these different research questions. And I studied a whole bunch of them, including mindset, placebo effects in different domains, social cognitive processing, et cetera. And you really find that, professors and researchers who do really well can sort of assemble a story. They get funding for their labs because they're tackling this kind of very coherent issue, sort of sequentially. And it's really the same thing for the college admissions process. Students are coming with an application in the same way that a researcher might come to a funding organization looking for money for their research and say, this is what I've done in the past. This is my resume. I'm passionate about this issue or this topic or this discipline. Here's what I've done, so you know that I'm credible, right? And I'm not just saying I want to do it, but I don't have any body of evidence. And here's sort of how I want to come to your institution and then sort of further advance this in the way that a researcher would further advance their experiments or line of research and maybe seek funding for that. So I think that that's really helped to shed a lot of light on the way that we approach the college admissions process and the way that we guide students to sort of tackle their own sort of issue and sort of build a resume around it.
That's an interesting way to think about the college admissions experience for our teens, and you certainly have the right background to help with that. So, as I talked about, it's gotten so competitive to get into college, and so I'm wondering what you think are the key factors that have made it so much more competitive, and how can students get in there and effectively land at the school of their choice?
Sure. So I would probably bifurcate the factors that have made the admissions landscape more competitive into two categories. So I'd say there's kind of quantitative factors, and then there are more sort of, we'll call them qualitative factors.
Mhm.
So quantitatively, and this is what people spend the most time talking about because numbers are very easy to understand and sort of pass along and kind of publicize in media. So everybody understands, for instance, when they see an article recently that will say, there's 20% more applications, or the applications are up 60% at MIT a few years ago, or all these top schools post-pandemic. And there has been that increase in quantity. So over time, for instance, we've seen a much larger number of international applicants applying to domestic colleges in the United States. So obviously they vie for a particular number of spots domestically in the United States. Over time, I mean, over long time horizons, 30 years, like if you went to school in the 90s, like a lot of our parents did, that's still 30 years ago. And then if you have 40, 50 years ago, just more and more students apply to college over time. They're prepared for college over time. College became like, at one point in time, college was something that was maybe could differentiate you in the marketplace. And now it's just kind of like everybody goes to college. Like, where's your degree from? So over time, we just sort of seen this progress towards having a much more educated, college-bound population in the United States, and certainly a lot more demand in the international marketplace as well. More recently, during COVID and post-pandemic, one of the major changes was that a lot of schools went test optional, as a lot of people might have heard and seen the deadline, the headlines, not the deadlines, the headlines about how the SAT is dead and whatnot. And we really are now in a really, test optional landscape. And what that does is it allows a lot more students to apply to colleges that they want to go to and put it in an application just to kind of try their hand without necessarily having test scores, right? So
Mhm.
in the past, you would have seen that there was this very significant obstacle to applying to a lot of these colleges. If you didn't have the test score that fell in their range, you would just maybe opt yourself out and say, it's just not worth me putting in an application to the school. But now you see, with this much more flexible landscape, you don't have to submit your test scores. Students will say, well, I have some A's, I'll give it a shot, apply to this school, apply to that school. And so kind of lowering that barrier to entry in the past few years has really opened up the floodgates to way more students applying to these colleges, and sort of giving it a shot, quote unquote. And so that's driven a significant increase in the number of applications in the past few years as well. So those are kind of some of the quantitative changes. Qualitatively, and I think this is something that doesn't get spoken about as much, and parents particularly underestimate, is we have a much smarter, much more robust, much more opportunity seeking and opportunity capitalizing student body. So if you grew up in the 1980s, or you're going to college in the 80s or the early 90s, you lived in a pre-internet age, right? You couldn't go on Twitter. There was no podcast. Like, you could have a teenager now who could run an online business. Like, they might do drop shipping through Amazon. Like, those opportunities did not exist in the world 30 years ago.
Mhm.
And so with the internet era, you have students can now do science research with a university professor. They can reach out to anybody. They can email a professor at a university. A lot of high schools have science research programs where they can conduct original science research. And students have, test preparation. They have access to SATs and ACTs online. So many resources, especially due to the emergence of the internet. And there's just so many more opportunities out there where students who really if you're not taking advantage of those opportunities, you're falling behind a lot of the students in the modern age. And I think that's something really important for parents to understand, is just this natural progress in anything. Like if you were talking about sports, like if you look at athletes in the 1920s, like Babe Ruth, he looks like an overweight, plumber maybe. He doesn't look like a kind of like an athlete that you would see in baseball now, where they're gargantuan, right. And, like there's all sort of cutting edge technology, fitness, nutrition science. And people take for granted that that hasn't happened in the college admissions landscape, but it has. Students are a lot more able-bodied, so to speak, and much more competitive applicants.
Wow, that's interesting. There was something that you talked about with the SAT. Is it dead? And also what I'm wondering is, with this whole test optional approach, do you believe that students who probably wouldn't have gotten in before are being admitted now to some of the prestigious institutions without their test?
Yeah, so a couple of good questions. I would say that the SAT is dead is a good New York Times or Washington Post headline, but it's not totally true. Certainly, some of the numbers are down, and the influence is sort of it's definitely waning a bit in terms of the test, because they are optional, right? They are elective. In the past, people couldn't have gotten around them. So they need to kind of go through the SAT or the ACT. So I wouldn't say that it's dead. There's still a substantial number of test takers for both the SAT and the ACT in the United States. And the way to sort of view testing, and the way that we like to describe it to families, is it's an elective or optional factor. So if it's going to help your candidacy, you want to take the test and you would want to submit those scores. If it's not going to reflect well upon you, then you shouldn't. Or if you take the test and you can't get a score that's going to be a top score for the college that you're applying to, then you should not submit it, because it will hurt your candidacy, right? And so it really just depends on, you get to choose whether you're submitting it to most schools in the United States. So submit it if it's going to boost your application, and don't submit it if it's going to bring down your application. So I wouldn't say it's dead, but it's a much more complex landscape. And now there's a lot more strategy now that goes into whether I submit my test score. And students might submit their test scores to some schools where they're in the higher part of the range, and they might not submit them to some other schools where they're in the lower part of the range. And so it actually, unfortunately, for a lot of students and families, has become way more complicated, because it used to just be you had to submit it regardless. It's very easy. Right. Now it's like, do I, where do I, these scores higher, etc. In terms of the second question about whether students are able to sort of, so some other admissions companies, consulting companies in our industry call them squeakers. Yes. Squeakers are sort of the students who, maybe have very low test scores, but they kind of are able to squeak by, into a very competitive college. I kind of make what you will of that term. I think it's much more complex. So what you have to understand is, if you have a student who's not submitting test scores, but let's say contextually that student goes to one of the top 10 high schools in the United States. So let's say in your area, you might know Thomas Jefferson, right? It's considered, right? TJ colloquially is considered the best public school, maybe the best school in the entire United States. Very talented student body. If you went to Thomas Jefferson, you took all the hardest classes, and you had a top GPA, I'm not very worried as an admissions officer that you can handle like a college curriculum, right? So I wouldn't really be worried as much that you didn't submit test scores. It'd be very weird if you went to TJ and were a top student and weren't able to do well on the test, and didn't submit test scores. But I wouldn't be worried about your prospects for being prepared for college, because I don't have this kind of standardized, measure. And also, if a student maybe has an amazing resume, maybe they ran a successful business doing $500,000 in revenue a year, maybe they're a first generation student who comes from a low SES background and does two full-time jobs to support their family, but they don't have standardized test scores. Those would be kind of good use cases where the student might have other really promising features, and that sort of diminishes the importance of submitting a test score. So it would really depend on their overall candidacy. They bring other things the colleges might be looking for. One of those things now tends to be diversity, is that not having a standardized test tends to increase the number of diverse students who apply to a college, and therefore the number of diverse students that a college can admit.
Okay. We'll be right back after this. You love your kids. You do your very best for them. But sometimes it feels like it's just not enough. And you're so sure you're the only one who feels this way. The truth is, you're not alone. It is also true that there are some things you're doing quite right. And there's a community who would love to exchange ideas with you. I'm Carol Maletta, creator of the Parenting 411, a portal for parents where I share information parents need through webinars and masterclasses. And not only that, the parents there support each other on this amazing journey in the Parenting 411 community group on Facebook. I can't wait to meet you in the community. And we're back with the Parenting 411. Now, in your experience, what really does it take for students to get into their top choice schools and to top schools? And, are there any common strategies or qualities that they have that really stand out?
Sure. So the biggest misconception, I would say, in the admissions process is a lot of parents think that colleges are looking for quote unquote well-rounded students. So that is the student who, plays an instrument, they play the piano, the violin, they do some community service, they, play a sport, they're on the varsity team, they're part of like a mixed array of clubs at the high school with no particular theme. And it's very much like a quantity approach versus a quality approach, right? It's like, well, they have to have all these things. They have to be a broad student, right? Well-rounded. But they've kind of overlooked the importance of depth of the quality of the activities that they're part of. And admissions officers are fundamentally looking for students who, as I mentioned earlier, if you are a researcher and you're applying for a grant and you wanted to motivate why they should give you $1 million for your future research, you wouldn't be like, well, I've studied this topic, and 18 other topics. It would be like, no, I've studied this topic super deeply and I'm one of like the world's foremost experts in this area. So you would be wise to give me money because like I'm very promising and probably will make a breakthrough in this very particular vertical or topic or issue. And it's the same thing for a student. It's really the same thing as if you're applying for a job, right? It's, I want to see, do you have the relevant experience, the relevant resume? So if you're applying for business, have you run a business? Are you the president of the business club? Were you part of a competitive business summer program? Did you work at a store and work your way up to like a managerial level? And a lot of parents don't understand that what admissions officers and competitive colleges are looking for is students who have that very defined resume and excellence in a more particular field that they will be telling the college that they're going to be applying for when they put it in the application. And that's everything, right? So certainly you should have good grades, certainly grades in classes that would be relevant to that area, right? So if you're doing engineering, your math and STEM grades better be very good. Your STEM scores on your testing should be good if you're submitting testing. You should have a very strong STEM resume. You should have done an engineering internship or science research and engineering. And so it's really looking at it like a job application. There's definitely a base of GPA and course rigor and all of that. I think most people sort of understand because that's been historically always true. But they kind of underappreciate the importance of students, particularly in their resume, having a very focused theme that they've pursued that will connect to what they want to study in college.
Okay. So how do you talk with your clients about fit and, how important is that? And, and then on the other side, in terms of the admissions directors, how does it really fit into the process, and how can students decide whether a school is a good fit for them academically, socially, personally? How do you help?
Sure. So, on the question of whether fit is important, I think fit is exceptionally important. I think a lot of parents, we certainly do come across certain students and families where, the brand of the college is very important, the title, the name. And a lot of that's just due to the fact that, we generally believe that opens up certain networks and opportunities. And it's just a very clear signal that you have it in your resume and you're kind of more, enticing. And I think that's definitely true and should be valued. But there are students who could land at a school that maybe has a very nice brand name, but they didn't particularly understand the culture of that school
Mm-hmm.
or the ethos. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to go to MIT, like, it's no joke. Like, you have to understand what you're getting yourself in for. And
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of schools that have a particular culture or ethos, and you want to make sure that that aligns with your values, and is a good environment in which you can thrive. So I think it's very important because you're going to be there for 4 years, and the environment definitely will have a large impact. I mean, even the sorts of students, I think one of the pieces of value of going to a good school is your peers. Who are you surrounded by? Are they very motivated, aspirational? Will they make you better, or will they bring you down and make you worse and make you feel bad about doing your homework, on a, and kind of really excelling? So I think fit is very important. It's something we definitely talk a lot about in the process. And we
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure that college is a kind of like appropriate growth opportunity for students. We want to make sure they're not way over their head or in a culture that won't help them. And we
Mm-hmm.
also don't want to make sure that a lot of cases, like, they're just not growing at all and they're too comfortable and too safe. In
Okay.
terms of tactically how families can really go about ensuring that a college is a good fit,
Mm-hmm.
certainly having a college advisor who knows a bunch of colleges and their cultures is very helpful. Knowing what their academic strengths are they better in this area that you're interested in, are they better in that area, do they have internships or networking or particular resources? But certainly going through sort of the demonstrated interest items. So doing your campus visits, even a repeat campus visit, going back if you're deciding between a couple of colleges,
Mm-hmm.
information sessions, everything's virtual now. Go to the website, sign up for the mailing list. Colleges track whether you click on the videos and those links nowadays. Like, they track that to see if you're coming to the school or not. Go to their Facebook. Well, probably a lot of kids aren't going to be Facebook, but Instagram, and social media, and really just do your due diligence. Ask students who've gone there in the past that that from your family or friends or your high school, and you can get a pretty good sense of if the colleges are a good fit for you.
Now, you talked about how parents and students have this idea that they have to have this wide range of experiences and make sure they check all of these boxes, and some of them are not focused on depth. But college admissions officers, oftentimes they say this kind of thing, like
Mhm.
they want the well-rounded student, as you said. Um, are there any hidden factors that make a significant impact on applicants' chances? You said depth for sure, depth in
Mhm.
the areas of interest that the student is claiming. Anything
Mhm.
else?
Um, I would say that really, to the first point about what admissions officers say and what they do, that's kind of like most human beings. What you say and what you do tend to not always to be 100% aligned. Um, the other phrase that I like to use a lot in terms of admissions, or when people listen to admissions officers, and I'm not saying that everything they say isn't true, but you need somebody who's an expert and can go through the nuances of what they say. Sometimes they don't intend to say something or to mislead, but it just comes out in a way where, if you understand how an admissions officer perceives the world, and then how that's going to land to a high school student's ears or a family,
Mhm.
parents' ears, you can understand why it might be confusing to them. So an admissions officer might say something like, a certain number of our applicants this year who admitted had jobs, right? But that if you were to go say, okay, so they're saying that at Johns Hopkins, one of the best universities in the world, I need to go get a job because that's what a lot of the applicants had. But you're not parsing through the nuances of that. You might go get a job, working, 20 hours a week as a camp counselor over the summer. Do you really think that that's going to separate you at like a top 10 college just because you had that job? It's
Mhm.
not, right? But if you maybe came from a more diverse background or lower socioeconomic background and you had a full-time job to support your family, that would be impressive. If you had a job and you worked at a restaurant and you worked your way up to a managerial level as a 17 or 18-year-old, that would be a great job and very impressive, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's a lot of people can't unpack the nuances of what they're saying. And a lot of ways that statement of having a job is in a lot of ways just a proxy for more diversity in the applicant pool. Because students might have to support their families, or they might need to, and there's students who come from those backgrounds, and it might not apply to other students. So you have to sort of understand who they're talking to, who they're not talking to, like, and it's very nuanced. The other thing that I like to say is if you want to, if you want to catch a fish, you don't ask a fish how to catch a fish, you ask a fisherman, right? So admissions officers in this analogy are the fish. You are trying to catch them or get them to let you into the university. You're much better off understanding somebody who actually has been able to consistently get students into those top schools, like we have fortunately as an advising team. And admissions officers can say certain things, and they really are brand officers for their institutions. So they're marketing officers, as I call them. So their main agenda, and it's really important that students and parents understand this, is to get the greatest number of applicants to apply, because the number of spots doesn't change, so that will lower their acceptance rate, right? Like that is fundamentally one of the main goals of admissions offices, is to lower the acceptance rate, because that makes you a more prestigious university. And how do you do that? Well, you don't usually do that by building more dorms and making more students able to come to your school. You do it by getting more students to apply to the school and then still taking the same number of students, right? So that's why it's important that we take what admissions officers say with a lot of kind of a grain of salt. I would say depth tends to be the most mistaken thing. I think families understand having great test scores, great GPA, taking hard courses. That's kind of pretty par for the course. I think most people understand that. The depth is very important. But I will also say, I'll throw in one more factor, which is just be scarce. So just be rare, right? If you do what everybody else does, you will get the result that most people get. So at most of the colleges in the United States, right now, even top 30, 40, 50 schools, like they're trending towards like 10% overall acceptance rate. So that means for every one they take, 9 don't get in. If you do what most people do, you play an instrument, you do community service, you're part of a diverse array of clubs, you probably will get the same results that most people do who are doing the same exact thing as you. So understand, can I do something? Do I have like a unique, weird quirk about me or interest or weird hobby that's just like odd and different? Embrace that weirdness, that uniqueness, because it will make you much more scarce, and you are vying for a very scarce number of spots in the admissions pool.
So you talk about depth, and it takes time to build depth on your resume and, to show that track record in grades and your extracurricular activities. So how early should applicants start focusing on this aspect so that they can successfully land at their desired school? And are there any particular activities or experiences that are particularly valued by admissions officers?
Yeah, so in terms of how early, we typically, the earliest that we tend to work with families will typically be later middle school, so around 7th, 8th grade typically. Certainly 9th grade's a pretty good time to start. A lot of people start by 10th or 11th grade because they know they're getting closer to the end of the line.
That's kind of late, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit later. We have some 10th grade families come in and they're like, we're so ahead of, everything. We're like, well, if you're building a resume, it takes a lot of time, right? It could take several years, right? And so I think one thing that's important that sort of speaks to that question, that's important for families to understand is, if you're just a parent, I think you'll understand this well. If you're in a career, you understand that it's very cumulative, right? It's like you build early skills on like an entry-level job, and then maybe you move up to a middle tier and then a higher tier. But you understand that the skill set that you have after 10, 20, 30 years in your job is much higher and much more advanced than it was in year 1 or year 2 or year 3. It's the same thing when a student's trying to build their resume or their depth. You have to kind of start building some skills to start. So if you want to like operate a business, and there are a lot of students who do, kind of parents are like, that's crazy. Like they're high schoolers running businesses. Yes, like there are very impressive students out there. And So, I mean, even if you're in seventh or eighth grade or ninth grade, starting to take some of the introductory courses, take an online course, take a Coursera course, maybe a summer program that's not too difficult to get into or super competitive, but you can get in and get some basic foundational knowledge. Maybe you want to learn how to code, start learning the basics of computer science,
Mm-hmm.
or running a business. And then you're going to move up to a middle tier, and now maybe you can then apply to some a little bit more competitive summer programs, right, that have some more qualifications that you would need. You need to be a little bit older,
Mm-hmm.
or now you're stepping up to the next level of running, a business or whatnot. And so you want to kind of view it as a very incremental, cumulative, sort of skill set. And so I think really late middle school is really a time to start thinking about this, and by the beginning of high school for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, I think you pretty much covered it. It was just
Okay.
really trying to, figure out how soon they should start because it takes time to build a track record
Yes.
in anything, really. Now, I wonder if you could share a success story of a student who went through your program and ultimately gained their admission to their dream school, or maybe it could be a composite of students who have done this, and so if you could describe what the key factors were that contributed to their success.
Sure. So I'll go through one particular student that we had in this past application cycle. So this student came in halfway through junior year, so maybe around February junior year. So quite late to the process. Went to a very competitive private school, one of like the top 10 or 15 private schools in the country.
Mhm.
Um, and had very high grades, very high GPA, very high test scores, 99th percentile test scores, and sort of this very typical, well-rounded, diverse, set of experiences. This club, that club, this thing, that thing. And she was aiming for very competitive colleges. And so for those colleges, students who go to great high schools, have top GPAs, top course rigor, and top test scores are a dime a dozen. And we needed to make her much more unique. We need to
Yeah.
make sure that she had a very compelling admission story, a unique, weird, maybe quirky or different sort of an interest that would sort of set her apart. So we like to use the term like uniqueness building, is very important to make you seem more unique or stand out. Um, One of the other things that I think it's important for people to understand is admissions does take into account a lot of demographic factors,
Mhm.
diversity. There are certain students. So she came from an Asian American background, Indian American. She was a female. There are way more competitive females now in the applicant pool than there are males. A lot of people
Mhm.
don't know that or understand that. Um, so what she was going to do, or her family's plan was, I think she was going to do like a biomedical internship or something like that. That had nothing to do with a bunch of her resume. She would have been massively overrepresented as an Asian American female doing biomedical sciences at a top school, and would have
Mhm.
put herself into a very competitive subsegment of the college application pool because there's so many students who want to do biomedical or pre-med or be a doctor.
Mhm.
What we found in her background was she had a very focused, long-standing interest in the arts.
Okay.
We knew that she was very underrepresented demographically in the arts because not
Mhm.
as many Asian Americans pursue the arts. They tend to pursue a lot of pre-professional areas like law, medicine, engineering, etc. So we
Mhm.
knew that that was going to be strategically well positioned for her, and she had it. It was something she had pursued for a very long time, and she loved it.
Mhm.
And we took that and we extended her interest in arts, and connected it to some science and psychology and emotional well-being. And she ended up getting a very high-profile science research opportunity with a prestigious college in California.
Mhm.
She ended up launching a nonprofit that did workshops that used the arts for emotional and mental health and took it to a
Mhm.
very high level before she applied to college. And we told this very compelling story about how she was using the arts and connecting it to things like psychology, neuroscience, and how she would investigate that further and pursue it further in college. And she was ultimately admitted to the University of Pennsylvania this past application cycle. So that was kind of one of the examples of how we sort of work with students and engage them and help them to really build that very strategic, well-positioned admissions narrative that will set them apart.
Now, you've spoken a few times about students from diverse groups and, that schools are looking for that, but they're not just looking for students from diverse groups. I mean, within that, I mean, they have to be able to withstand the academic rigor and
Sure.
have a good fit and all of that. How do you work with those students to differentiate themselves from, I mean, because being diverse isn't enough, to position themselves not only vis-a-vis other people in diverse groups, just like them, but also students who aren't coming from diverse groups. What are some tips for them?
Yeah, so I think our process, so we do get families who the student has an element of diversity. And I think a lot of times what we tend to see is the families really like, they kind of harp on it, or they think like that single-handedly is going to get them in because the mom's from, Peru, or the grandma's from Peru, and I think, to me, and one of our senses is, it's not even a great feeling as a student to think you're going to get in because your mom was
Exactly.
born in another.
That's why
I
I'm
think that's
asking.
I think it's a very discouraging message that, you're just part of a quota. Not that there is a formal quota, because there isn't at many of these colleges, but I think that's a very bad signal to send to a lot of students. And I think a lot of parents, they make too much of it anyway from a strategic standpoint. And I think a lot of the other people who don't come from those backgrounds also make way too much of it, right? It's very easy to say, a lot of people do this sort of like, shaming, where they're like, oh, this kid got into Penn, but they're a legacy. It's like, well, there are a ton of legacies at Penn, and most of them still don't get in, right?
Right.
So it's very easy because it's simple, right? It's very easy to say, oh, they got in because of this, right? It's like, well, no, maybe they did a lot of other things that you don't know about. They probably did. So yes, the way that we would approach those students is still do the same things as if you didn't have any, didn't have that benefit or that wild card, because you don't even know in a lot of cases how far that's going to get you anyway. And I think, some admissions companies or consulting companies will say, oh, we know that this kid got in, because they came from this background and they needed a student from Tennessee or something like that, or they needed a student from Idaho, or, or this country, or Brazil, or, this background, or the first generation. We will take those nuances into account, but we're not complacent, and we don't take for granted they're going to get in because of those things. So we still treat them the same way that we would treat a student who has every benefit, every luxury. And we say, like, you still need to like find something that you really love, you're passionate about, build a resume around it, add depth. And also, not even because it's important for college, but because that will serve you way more in the long term anyway, to just say, oh, well, because you have this title or this label, you're going to get in, but you're missing the point. You're not doing anything that's going to help you long term, because you're not building any more valuable skills or experiences in this area that you're interested in.
Yeah. I wanted to definitely drive that home, because I know that when our sons were, applying to college, I have twin sons, so we were doing that times two, everything times two there at the same time. And so one of our sons was invited to apply for a prestigious academic scholarship at the college of his choice. But we heard from a lot of naysayers, well, he can do it, but he's not who they're looking for. Like, he didn't have a hard enough story. Without saying so much, he just hasn't had enough hardship in his life. So whatever. So, we did it anyway. We're like, we don't know his story. And maybe everybody has a journey. And so you don't know. And so, of course, he completed the application, and it was pretty rigorous process, required a visit, all kinds of interviews and observations of, him and the other students in different settings. And, he got it. But, it wasn't just, so it's really about the background and the story that you've been building, the story you've been living. and that will get you into these places. And I think that's a lot of what you're saying too. I mean, this is, of course, aside from the grades you have to have and all of that. And he certainly had the grades and the experiences, leadership experiences and things like that. But it really is about your story and being true to that story and being authentic when they look at it.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah. So, with increasing emphasis on holistic admissions, just looking at a lot of things, how important are the good old recommendation letters and the essays in the decision-making process, and how can students stand out there?
Sure. So in terms of recommendation letters, that is one of the main items that we work with our students on when we advise them. And I think a lot of families don't understand, what are you going to do as an advisor to work on their recommendation letters? Like, don't they just ask the teacher and the teacher writes them a letter of recommendation? And what a lot of families don't know about letters of recommendation is there tend to be a lot of materials that are given to the student and the family to help write that letter. So teachers, for example, will give out sort of questionnaires or forms to the students, and they'll say, what was your shining moment from this class? What was a piece of adversity or a difficulty in this class, which you should generally not answer and pivot around that question. It's not a good question. So they'll give out these forms and questionnaires, and one of the things that we do is we help students put into those forms the types of content that will really help them shine in a letter of recommendation. And sometimes teachers just inadvertently, they don't ask the best questions in those forms. Sometimes they ask a question that would paint a student in a bad light, where a student maybe volunteers something about themselves, like, oh, I had like a B- in this class at the beginning of the year, and then I brought it up, but you don't necessarily want to tell a college that. Whereas like they were to see your grade at the end of the year, that was an A. You don't need to tell them that you had a bad grade in the class for most of the year. Like, why would you tell them that? And so we really help to help students create those letters in the most strategic way. Same thing for guidance counselors. A lot of families don't understand that guidance counselors also write you a letter of recommendation. At most of the colleges, they require a guidance counselor letter of recommendation. And that will really help to contextualize your role in the school community, your intangibles, what teachers say about you. It should provide context in terms of, did you challenge yourself a bunch in terms of the course rigor and what was offered by that school, etc. And so it's a much broader kind of letter of recommendation that's much more about kind of at the school level in general, your role in the community, your role in the school community, than just the teacher and one sort of class can often speak to, right? And that's also a very important letter. And parents can often chime into that. Often they'll ask you for a parent statement, or there'll be a parent brag sheet or a questionnaire. And it's the same thing. You have to be careful because a lot of parents will say things that are very generic, like, Johnny's very hardworking and well-rounded. And it's like, well, everybody who applies to these schools is also hardworking, and you don't want to be well-rounded. So you should say neither of those two things in your letter, right? And so that's very important, is to think very carefully about those letters of recommendation and those forms that they give you, materials. If they don't give you any materials or forms, you better find a way to provide them some information. So send them an email, schedule a meeting, but make sure that you get very compelling content across so that they have it at their disposal to write these letters. And they will be more than happy to include it in the letter, usually, as long as it's true, because they have a lot of letters to write. So the more information you give them, the easier you make their life in writing the letter, right?
Yeah.
So they are very important. Students who want to go to particularly very competitive schools need to have very glowing letters of recommendation. And even in the common application, they ask the teacher to rank, is this like, an average student that you've had historically? Is this like your best student that you've ever had? And so you want to make sure that, they're rating you very high. A student who's going to a very top school, you should be like one of their favorite students from the past 5 years or 10 years, or maybe the best student they've ever had if you want to go to MIT. So they are important. And admissions now, especially like more competitive schools, is a game of millimeters, not a game of miles. Like every little thing you can do to separate yourself from very talented kids is very important. In terms of the essays, that's going to be very interesting this year because I think a lot of people know what's going on with artificial intelligence and chat GPT.
Oh, right,
And
right.
now they're banning the, chat GPT. Schools now are not giving at-home writing assignments because they know kids can use chat GPT to write a whole English essay now.
Okay.
Um, so we're kind of a little bit in the at a crossroads in terms of where essays and stuff like
That's
that.
going to
I
be
also
interesting.
I also
Okay.
wouldn't a little bit of a sleeper topic that people have not considered yet is
Sure.
whether teachers might use chat GPT to write their letters of recommendation. um, that's an interesting one too. Everybody's like, oh no, teachers would never do that. It's like, I don't know. They have 60 letters of recommendation to write. You can write them pretty quickly if you just tell
I,
chat GPT to write some content.
I would think so, but I guess the more, I mean, because that tip is so important that you just shared about that process of giving them as much information to
Mhm.
work with as possible, because I think a lot of people overlook that. And
Right.
I'd be willing to bet with all of the recommendations that they have to write, they may use chat GPT, but I suppose if you give them
The
information that they
content.
can work with, give them some content, maybe they won't
Right.
rely as heavily on it. Maybe it will just be for editing and grammar. I mean, maybe it'll just
Yeah.
be
Yeah. Yeah. The content will definitely be the most important. And I think they're not going to be as worried about a teacher potentially using ChatGPT as a student who's writing their whole college essay
yeah,
using
that's
ChatGPT. But I think that'll be a very interesting crossroads for this year. As all of society sort of tries to see what the role of artificial intelligence is going to be
I
in the future.
wonder if it could be a situation where in the future, colleges could assign you an hour-long block of time
Mhm.
online to type your essay, you know,
So
or something
yeah,
like that. We'll be right back after this. As the saying goes, mother's work is never done, except when it really is. I'm talking about my new book, Mother's Work, Pearls of Wisdom and Gems from My Journey. I share my transformation from an outmanned, overwhelmed mom of twin boys to a parenting strategist and consultant, and being honored as DC Mother of the Year by American Mothers Incorporated. In Mother's Work, I tell you about the 7 guideposts that kept me anchored as I weathered the peaks and valleys of motherhood. Grab your copy at carolmaletta.com/motherswork. And we're back with the Parenting 411.
Yeah, one of the things, so Princeton actually historically added a graded paper that you had to submit so they could check to see whether it aligned the
Oh,
writing style with your essays.
sure.
Um, nowadays you could say, well, maybe that essay was just written in ChatGPT anyway, so they're checking a ChatGPT essay against another ChatGPT essay. I think students, if any students are listening or parents are listening, there are definitely tools that are coming out that will be plagiarism checkers. You can ask ChatGPT, did you write this? Or
Oh,
so you're on a very risky, like you better be careful if you do something like that, because if you get caught, the risk is exceptionally high that you could be caught with your hand in the cookie jar or the chat GPT jar. And it might have really bad consequences. So obviously students and families should understand like that's a big societal thing right now. We don't know how exactly it's going to play out. But setting aside all that technology stuff, the essays historically have been very important, particularly in the way that a cover letter for a job is very important. It articulates your story, right? So why are you applying for this job? Meaning, why are you applying to study this thing at this college, or why do you want to go to this college? What have you done in your resume? How can you make sense of your resume for me? So why is this experience in your resume relevant to this thing that you want to do in the job, or going to this school, or applying to this school? And so it really is your longest form opportunity to really articulate and make sense of all of this data that they're seeing. Because when they look at your resume, you only get 150 characters in the Common App to elaborate on each one of those activities. This is nothing, right? It's like 15 words, right?
right.
So if you want to tell them how all these activities come together and make sense, and why this connects to this and then connects to this class at the college that you're going to study, you're going to need a longer form opportunity to talk about it. And that's where the essays typically tend to come in, is to articulate and put together that story.
Well, we know the process overall can just really be stressful for teens and their families. So, how do you help alleviate that stress and anxiety associated with the process, both for the student and for their parents? And what strategies and resources can you tell us about?
Sure. So I probably will have a little bit of an interesting take on this. I think that people get this a little bit backwards. I don't think you can sort of, you know, uh, I think competence precedes confidence, right? If you want to be really confident and feel really good, you need to do the things that you're supposed to be doing to put
Okay.
yourself into that good mental framework and good mental state. So we always saw this with example with test preparation. You would have students or parents say, oh, like the student's not a good test taker or something. It's like, but they don't know this topic. They don't know that topic. They don't know that grammar rule. They don't know that grammar rule. It's like, do you think they probably would be a better test taker if they knew what the test was testing them on? Probably. Do you think they would be a better test taker if they came into the office every single weekend for 20 straight weeks and took a full practice test versus they just do their homework and maybe they're on TikTok and then they do a homework question? It's like, that's not the real test setting. So it's like, if you had 20 live reps of taking a full test, by the 21st time you take it for the real thing, you're gonna be like, I do this all the time. Like, this is like a habit, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way that we try to tackle stress and anxiety is competence first, confidence second. You can't have confidence until you have competence.
Okay.
So it's not going to be about like, I'm not stressed or don't feel stressed or don't worry about it. It's not going to work on teenagers, right? Like, don't worry about it. You'll get in somewhere. Like, you'll be okay. It's like not going to de-stress them. What's going to de-stress them is when they feel like they're working with professionals, experts who really know what they're doing. They're not sure, like, oh, my guidance counselor's telling me this, but I'm not sure. Is that really right? Because I have A's, I can go to Harvard. It's like if you have, I think, a really professional process, you seek expert opinion, you're on top of your stuff. And that's how we try to run the advising process. We had a student this past cycle. I remember working with her, and she was like in the middle. I think we were like maybe early October, and she was like, all my friends are so stressed out about all of their applications and all this. And her applications were all done. They were all amazing. Like, she knew what we were doing was correct, even though people said to do other things and she was hearing other stuff.
Yeah.
And she felt really good. And she was way more stressed about she was applying to a science research competition. She was way more stressed about that than applying to college, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because her science research program and her teacher weren't as good and weren't on top of things and weren't as competent. And so she was really stressed about that. And I think if the process is handled very well, it's organized very well, it's professionalized, that will give you a lot of confidence and sort of help to attenuate the stress.
Now, in the time that you've been doing it, and maybe social media has been around the whole time you've been doing it, but I just wonder how, um, if there's any kind of correlation in terms of, students that just spend so much time, get their news from Twitter and, just are so just, wrapped up in that versus other students who still read books, even if it's on a device, but still read books and still do things, make connections in the real world. How, those two different extremes of types of students, does one group do better or it doesn't matter today?
In terms of their
And,
candidacy or how
and
admissions
yes, in
officers?
terms of getting into colleges and, positioning themselves to get into top colleges.
Yeah, so I would say I I think one interesting thing is how you use social media,
Mhm.
because there are students who use social media for their business or for
Okay.
marketing, or in which case you're like, well, social media is exceptional because it's an amazing marketing tool, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yep.
you would look at that kid and you'd be like, oh, they did like this really creative, innovative marketing for their business, like via social media, or maybe they leverage social media to sync up with a university professor so they could do science research, right? And so I think it's important that people understand that these are just tools. And a lot
Right.
of the kind of negative use cases that we talk about are because people use them in a way that is not helpful or
Yes.
promoting positive things. But that's more on us than it is on the tool itself in a lot of cases, right? So it's like, if you're like, well, social media is bad because people spend too much time on it, it's like, well, don't spend as much time on social media, right? It's not like it didn't cause you to spend a lot of time in social media.
Right.
So I think it has a lot of really potentially beneficial things. And this is what we talk about with all technology, right? It can be really great. AI could be amazing, or there could be really negative ramifications, right? And it just depends on what we do with it, right? I think certainly students who still read books. We had an advising student this past cycle who called herself sort of like an old soul. Like she was doing knitting and like she would read these old books, and she had like, you know, it's kind of cool. Like that kind of would be like kind of funny to an admissions officer. And I love, like, even sometimes I walk by, you know, in New York City, I see a kid like, you know, at a restaurant and they're not on their phone and they're reading like a book. And I'm like, I'm really happy about that. Like that's a great kid. Like, you know, maybe we should recruit them as an advising student. But I don't think that there's anything huge to be made out of, you know, do you read, you know, are you on social media or book? I mean, I think it depends on what you're doing and how you're using the tools. And there are ways that are more productive and less productive. You're reading a book to learn and you're doing social media to see where your friends went out on the weekend. Like you could probably guess which of those two students is probably going to be a more competitive student in the admissions landscape, but not because you're going to tell an admissions officer that you read a lot of books, but just because that tends to lead into certain traits like intellectual curiosity and vitality that are just correlated with a lot of other traits psychologists are looking for.
Yeah, that, you know, the reason why I was just curious about it is because my children, it was probably middle school or late elementary when a lot of things started to happen. So we did have a portion of their childhood where there was none of that. And then, you know, so I'm just curious, and, you know, and I just see so many, so many young people, when, you know, some of us too, but just always on these devices. Like when, you know, before we would have seen more books or we would have seen more conversation and whatever. And I was just wondering how it's, you know, affecting this process and college readiness, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think the other important point there too is kids have to be, one of the things that we see is kids do not know how to allocate their time appropriately in a lot of ways. And if you spend in aggregate 3.5 hours a day on social media and some other kids spend 3.5 hours doing science research, who do you think is going to win when you both apply to the same college? Right. So kids also have to be mindful of what are my goals and am I allocating my time towards the things that will get me towards my goals. And it's not that you necessarily have to have high goals or lofty goals, or that, you know, it's like, you know, maybe you don't, and maybe you can be spending 3.5 hours, or maybe you're a marketer and the 3.5 hours actually is you're like using it to help yourself in your candidacy. But I think kids and parents, they have to understand, almost even map out, like we encourage our students to map out the hours in their week that are going to different things. And then we can sort of show them a pie chart of like, here's how, if you wanted to accomplish this goal, you would ideally be allocating your time. And here's how you're actually allocating your time. And there's a big discrepancy between these two things. And when somebody puts it right in front of you like that, you can say, oh, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing because I'm spending 5 hours a day on Instagram. It's probably not going to help me achieve my goals.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. So how do you and your team stay up to date on all the latest trends and changes going on in the landscape so that you can pass this along to your clients?
Sure. So there are definitely a lot of different industries. There are a lot of professional organizations in college advising. So NACAC is one of the big ones and most reputed. I wouldn't say that we get a lot of information from professional organizations or conferences. A lot of it we tend to, and I think a similar mechanism can apply to a lot of students and families who want to get information and stay up to date, is see what's out there in terms of the media. There are certain thought leaders. So we know in our industry who the people are. We would obviously like to count ourselves among that class of very top thought leaders and people who have very cutting edge strategy in college admissions. But there are a few very top companies, I think, that are doing an excellent job and are leaders of the advising field. So, like if they have a blog, if they have resources, like consuming that information. We have a newsletter, for example, where you can get things digested for you. And so we stay on top a lot of in terms of, what admissions officers are saying. We take it with a grain of salt, right? Some things you have to know how to parse them correctly. Different trends that kind of get released. And a lot of this sort of tends to kind of get out there. And then you can follow it on a school by school basis, their website, their media, different things like that. One of the things that I think we do that is very unique to our company in particular, and I don't think a lot of students and families can't necessarily do this because they don't have the expertise and other advisors just don't do it, is we really try to find a lot of data. Like if we have a kid at a certain high school, maybe we can get their friends' applications and find out where they got in, what were in their applications. And we can build up a very large database and sort of aggregate, okay, well, this kid applied here, they got into there, and they had this background. And we'll follow all the acceptances for different high schools that our kids come from. We digest the school profiles that those high schools send to the colleges and the way that the high school brands itself. And we might say your high school's branding itself to this college, and they're not branding themselves very well. Like, honestly, like the college doesn't know what the heck this like weird spiral curriculum with like no APs. Like we have this like social emotional theory of mind class, the colleges, what is that? Like, and there are ways that these different 28,000 high schools in the United States package themselves or present themselves in certain ways. And we really will almost, I'd like to say that even if you give us a school profile of a high school, you could probably understand the strategic nuances of that high school in 10 minutes more than an administrator who's been there for 30 years can. Like, we can see how they're presenting, how their course offerings would land, how an admissions officers would interpret this class. Like, this class is nothing. We don't care if a student took that class, but this class is really important. And so we really get into the trenches in terms of analyzing how do those high schools present themselves, what's the breakdown. We'll even ask students at those high schools, what's kind of the breakdown of interest, like how many kids are positioning themselves for this area, because you are kind of competing against the kids from your high school. So if, for instance, you're going to have 100 aspiring biology majors all coming from the same high school applying to the same colleges, that's a recipe for disaster if you're going to be another biology major who's coming from the same high school applying to all the same colleges. And so it's very helpful to understand what people around you are doing. And we try to have a little bit of, it almost sounds like espionage, but we like to have a little bit of a sense of what you're doing because you need to stand out from what a lot of people are doing. A lot of families do the total opposite. So what they do is like they have neighbors and family friends or the mom at the, the yoga club or whatever, and they listen to what they're doing. And then they try to do the same exact thing, right? And that's the total opposite. What you would want to avoid the most would be herd behavior and herd mentality, because definitionally what you're trying to do is be among the few, not be among the most and just the common. And well, I've seen this application a million times because it has all the same activities that kids in Westchester typically tend to do, like, or whatever area, Northern Virginia or Silicon Valley. Like there are certain things and proclivities. If you come from a certain geographic area, you have particular resources, ethos, etc. And so it's very easy for you to blend in without you even understanding that you're blending in, just because like you have all those sort of correlations. So I think that's one thing that we do particularly well. We have a very logical, analytical, research-driven approach, and we are on the ground floor a lot of times of understanding what's going on at a high school, how are kids packaging, applying, and a lot of the liabilities or upsides.
So interesting. I mean, as you're talking about that, even I'm thinking about our town's magazine, our city's magazine. Every year, pretty soon, it'll come out with the schools apply to and the numbers of students that got in. And so when I compare the 3 high schools in our city, and and I often have questions about why do the students from that school seem to get more of them get into Harvard, say, or whatever. And that branding piece, I mean, I think that's interesting. I wonder how many high schools, I mean, I know they have a lot to do, and I wonder how many of them are really paying attention to how they're branding. I mean, TJ, I know they've got that down. But
Sure.
some of these other schools, I wonder what they're doing. Or are they just submitting something, a basic school profile here, here's what you need, but not really thinking about how they can differentiate themselves from the others. So that's interesting. And then
Yeah.
also,
Yeah. One important thing on that point is, why should the people who are creating those school profiles care? Like, why are they incentivized? Like, what does it do for them if more kids, like, they present themselves better and they put in the effort? Or, I mean, a lot of our parents ask us, like, can you help our high school like present themselves better? Or like, you're telling us there are all these issues and we're fixing them on the back end. Like, we're having the guidance counselor say this thing that the college wouldn't know, or we get a kid who goes to a high school and there's like one really hard class at the high school that brings down all the GPAs, but the college doesn't know that. How would they know that out of 28,000 high schools that that's a really hard class, and you took it, but the other kid sidestepped the class, right? And well, we'll have the guidance counselor mention it. But I think it's important to understand, why should people even care at the high school level? And if they're properly incentivized, they will care. But if they're not properly incentivized, they might not care, right? So it's very important that people understand that there are certain interests and certain people have skin in the game of your kids' results and success. If you're hiring a private advisor, like, we have a lot of skin, like, we care a lot. But the guidance counselor, they don't get bonuses based off of how many kids got into Ivies in a particular year. So you do kind of need the old Latin phrase, like, who's going to guard the guards, right? It's like, you need, in some cases, a little bit of oversight, somebody who really knows what they're doing to make sure the other people are also doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Wow. So much valuable information here that you shared. Where can parents learn more about Westchester Prep and stay up to date on all that you're working on and any resources that you can offer?
Sure. So we have our website, westchesterprep.com. So you can head over there. That is our full ecosystem of tutoring, test prep, college advising services. We even have some cool virtual office hours. If kids need help in a particular subject, they can drop in late at night anywhere in the country for some help with their subject. So we have a lot of cool products and services, and we work with students all across the country, and we have all remote options. So not hard to work with us from anywhere, no matter where you are, even if you're outside of the main geographic footprint in Westchester, New York, where our offices are located. And then in terms of, we also have a college advising newsletter. So that's great for just kind of staying up to date, getting our kind of unique insight or takes on certain things. If you want us to translate what admissions officers say in a language that you can understand and act upon, for example, or take the jargon or the, marketing and publicity spiel out of it. You can sign up for our newsletter. So we're going to add a tool on the website where you can sign up for our newsletter if you go to the advising page, or you can also just like send us an email. In terms of social media, Facebook, we're Westchester Prep. So facebook.com/Westchester Prep. And our advising wing is going to also, probably by summer, fall 2023, we'll have a totally separate website that will be greatmindsadvising.com. And then also on Facebook, Instagram, Great Minds Advising. You can find us there as well. In the meantime, Westchester Prep is a great resource. And I would definitely suggest anybody wants to get in touch, contact us, any questions, or wants to get on the newsletter, just email us, call us, or go to the website and sign up.
Great, great. Any remaining burning issues you just have to get out?
Too many stored up inside here. No, I mean, I would just kind of wrap up by saying, I think one of the things that we try to underscore about the college process, it sounds like your kids have already maybe headed off to college. So
they graduated.
Okay. All right.
Last
So
year.
Maybe some of that stress and anxiety and solicitousness has already been purged from your soul. Whereas for some other parents who are listening to this and they have kids in high school or middle school or even earlier. And I think one thing that's really important, because I think a lot of parents get very anxious, and I think some of that anxiety is useful. Like, you want to make sure you're doing the right things, you're getting the right information, people are doing the right things, so you don't find out the hard way, as some people find out when they get their letters back. We regret to inform you, is the first line in a lot of people's letters when they hear back from college. So I think that's useful getting, expert eyes on the process and whatnot. But I think one of the things that's really important to underscore is I think this pressure that we've talked about that colleges have increasingly placed upon students to add more depth to their resume, have more focused interest. I believe a lot of parents think that that's just like a game or what you have to do for college, or you're creating something fake or an artifice, or parents will even say like, oh, that's so unfortunate they can't just go to college and like then figure it out maybe sometime, sort of, maybe, probably not. Like it is, I think, a very conducive pressure. I'm using the term pressure because a lot of students, I think a lot of people in life, if I said, you could have figured this out 5 years earlier, or instead of when you were 23 going and working an entry level job that you then backed out of and changed your career, if you could have done that internship when you were 16 and been 7 years ahead, wouldn't you want to do that? Like, isn't that kind of the point of parenting, is to like, you've already been down this road before, and then you get the chance to go teach it to your kids so they don't have to make the same mistakes that you did.
Yes.
And I think we see a lot of parents where they're like, talk to a mom who's like 50 and she's like, my son is like super perfectionistic, and this mom runs a company and they have like 5,000 employees under them and like are huge in the C-suite of a major company. I'm like, how long did it take you to figure out that perfectionism maybe isn't that helpful or conducive? And they're like, well, 2 years ago when I was 49. Well, it's like, how about we teach them when they're 13 or 14 that
Yes.
maybe they need to work with others and learn to collaborate and not be a perfectionist and delegate. They could be like 37 years ahead of you, basically. And it's like, isn't that one of the good things about being a parent? So I think a lot of these pressures that colleges are putting on kids to start getting some real data and learning about their passions and interests and actually pursuing them, rather than at some nebulous, obscure point in the future after a $300,000 tuition bill, is really helpful, and it really is good. And a lot of students can figure it out. Parents think they can't, but a lot of kids can figure it out. We do it all the time. They can figure out what they're passionate about and start getting some real data and some real experiences.
I like that so much. I mean, instead of seeing it as this insurmountable hurdle, it really is giving them a jump start on their future, really figuring things out. And also with those internships or other experiences, they can rule some things out too. Like, hey, I thought I was going to like this, but this just doesn't line up with the way I like to work. And learning that at an early age, I can certainly say, as someone who's not doing what I majored in, I'm very happy doing what I do, but this is what I majored in. I can say, and I learned that the first year on the job, this is not for me, but I had studied it, right? So thank you so much. This has really, really been an insightful interview. Thank you so much for joining me. And to all our listeners, of course, I'm so happy that you tuned into the Parenting 411 today, got some valuable information that you should be able to use. And if not, by all means, like, share, and subscribe this episode. Share it with someone who has children, even if they are younger. As Sam has said, it's never too early to just start at least thinking, looking ahead, and starting to channel your children into some experiences that may prepare them to be competitive and successful in applying to college. Also, for our Parenting 411 community, I want to tell you that we are offering the Parent and Purpose Summit Family First Edition, again, backed by popular demand. We're offering a free, not free, but an all access pass, lifetime all access pass to the summit. All you have to do is visit bit.ly/Family First 2023. That's bit.ly/Family First 2023. You'll have access to all of the wonderful interviews from the experts that we brought in to talk about mental health, parenting strategies, and self-care for parents. And you also have some bonuses from the Parenting 411. So you'll want to grab that all access pass. It really is going to be provide an unforgettable, informative experience for you. And as always, follow us at the Parenting 411 on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And remember, it is never too late to be the parent you want to be.